It's my great pleasure to be your moderator for what promises to be a very timely discussion hosted by BEUC as we explore a critical question: how pressure-proof are EU medicine prices? This question comes at a moment when pharmaceutical pricing is no longer just a healthcare issue. It's increasingly becoming a geopolitical and a trade issue. The US administration argues that American patients shoulder a disproportionate share of the global cost of pharmaceutical innovation, while European countries benefit from negotiating lower medicine prices. And one policy at the heart of this debate is the so-called MFN policy, which is the most favored nation policy. And in simple or plain terms, it aims to ensure that the United States pays no more for certain medicines than the lowest price paid by comparable high-income countries, and many of them are in Europe. Supporters of this policy argue this could help lower drug prices in the US, while critics argue it could instead create pressure for higher medicine prices in Europe without addressing the underlying drivers of high US drug prices. And a recent development, I'm sure many of you have seen it in the news, includes a US trade investigation into Germany's pharmaceutical pricing policies, and this has brought those tensions into even sharper focus. And at the same time, through all of this, European governments already face high medicine costs, constrained healthcare budgets, and growing expectations to ensure patients have timely access to innovative treatments. So the question today isn't simply whether Europe should pay more or less for medicines. It's how Europe can safeguard affordable access for patients, incentivize innovation, and respond to external pressures all at once. Those are exactly the questions we'll be exploring today, and we'll be hearing from a variety of perspectives during the panel. Now, before we dive in, I just have a few housekeeping things I want to share with you. As you heard, the event is recorded. And secondly, we've set aside time for audience questions at the end of the panel, so we encourage you to submit them in the Q&A box at the bottom throughout the discussion, and we'll try to get to as many as possible at the end. All right, now with all of this said, it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker for his opening remarks, Agustin Reina, Director General at BEUC. Agustin, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sara Taisir. It's really a pleasure that we are organizing this conversation. So really looking forward to it. Going to be very brief. I just want to share with you a little bit of our thoughts on where are we coming from when we decided to put forward this conversation. And as you probably know, for BEUC, a key objective is to ensure that medicines are available and affordable to consumers and patients across Europe. But I think, all share the increased concern of rising prices of innovative treatments in particular, but also the capacity of public healthcare system to cope with these trends. There is, of course, a difference between the US and Europe. In the European countries have healthcare systems that are part of the social protection framework, and this is a key difference from the US system, where healthcare coverage is much less comprehensive and more complex to navigate, and certainly the colleagues from the US will be able to talk about that. Because we know that accessing basic treatments such as insulin, for example, can be an everyday struggle for many American patients. But recent measures on medicine pricing announced by the current US administration have sparked the discussion around the impact on patients on both sides of the Atlantic. It's not something necessarily we were looking forward to, but because of the situation in the US, does have generated an important debate here in Europe, and we want to be able to contribute to that discussion as well from a public health perspective, but also from the perspective of consumers and patients. So very briefly, thank you very much to all the speakers, to all the participants and the audience, and especially to you, Sara Taisir, for moderating this conversation. So I'm very much looking forward, and I give you the floor back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Agustin, for your opening remarks and for helping set the stage further for our discussion. All right, I'd like to now introduce our esteemed panelists. So we have the pleasure of having with us Benedetta Baldini, who is Senior Policy Advisor at the European Social Insurance Platform, which is an alliance of statutory social insurances. Nice to have you with us. Next, we are joined by Peter Maybarduk, who is Access to Medicines Director at Public Citizen, which is a nonprofit consumer advocacy organization. Welcome to you, Peter.
Thanks, Sarah.
We also have with us Charlotte Roffian, who is EU Affairs Advisor at France Assos Santé, which is the National Coalition of Patient Associations and Healthcare System Users in France. Thank you for joining us, Charlotte.
Good afternoon.
And last but certainly not least, you may have noticed a change in our lineup. We are pleased to have with us Adrian van den Hoven, Director General at Medicines for Europe, which represents the European generic, biosimilar, and value-added pharmaceutical industries. Thank you for being with us, Adrian.
Thank you very much.
All right, everyone, we have a lot of ground to cover. I think this is a conversation that could go on for many hours, but we will do our best with the 60 minutes we have ahead of us. So I'd like to structure our conversation in 3 parts. So in the first part, we're going to unpack the US argument and ask whether Europe really is the problem here. And then in the second part, we're going to ask how should Europe respond to this external pressure from the US? And then in the last part of our panel, we're going to explore what exactly is Europe's long-term drug pricing and reimbursement vision? Like what's the long-term strategy here? So I'd like to dive right in because I'm keen to hear from you all. So as I mentioned, the US administration argues that Europeans benefit from lower medicine prices while American patients shoulder a disproportionate share of innovation costs. And so from your perspective, Peter, is that a fair characterization of today's pharmaceutical market? Why or why not?
Americans certainly pay extremely high prices for drugs, but so does everyone else. So do patients in Europe. And it's not Europe's fault that you have sensible policies to negotiate lower prices. The problem here isn't Europe, it's the pharmaceutical industry and the monopoly and lobby power that has allowed it to exert disproportionate influence itself on pricing structures. You know, in the United States, we have very few disciplines on price. It's only in the last few years that we've started negotiating medicine prices at all. That's for one program, not nationally the way that you have. It's for select drugs, and only after a drug has been on the market for basically approaching a decade. Americans should have policies that are more like European policies when it comes to medicine, not less. And Americans understand that. This is sort of one of the most drug pricing reform is one of the most popular issues for voters, Democrats and Republicans in the United States, which is why President Trump feels like he has to do something. But he's trying to find someone to blame that isn't the pharmaceutical industry, that doesn't require changing the pharmaceutical industry's business model because that industry has so much influence in our country. And, you know, we're concerned about 2 things. We're concerned about the distraction effect in the United States. Because this issue is so popular, there's a chance to pass really meaningful drug price reform in the United States by challenging the industry. And President Trump is trying to give them a pass and get around that. And then secondarily, of course, we're concerned about the effect on lives and health worldwide. There's a study out in the British Medical Journal this morning suggesting that the cost to the United Kingdom, which already caved and raised prices or at least planned expenditures in accordance with President Trump's demands, it's projected to cost the UK 45 billion, I believe it is, over 10 years and cost 230,000 lives, which is more people that died during COVID. So it's quite serious what we're talking about.
I want to hear from you next, Benedetta, but before that, I do want to play devil's advocate a little bit with you, Peter. It is true that Americans do pay more, I think 3.9 times more than the average European price, but they also gain earlier access to many innovative patients than patients do in Europe. So is there a trade-off between price and access that we also have to acknowledge? And what do you make of that argument?
I think there is some trade-off, but I think it would be a mistake to make concessions. Europe is a very attractive destination for the pharmaceutical industry. It's very profitable for the pharmaceutical industry. I was looking at one study that suggested in Switzerland, for example, there's a 40 to 90% profit margin on cancer drugs for the industry. I mean, these are, and in Germany, which the United States is targeted next, launch prices are actually going up 6% per year. So it's really consumers that should have the complaint and be investigating pharma, and Europe that should be investigating the United States, and not the other way around on this. There are ways to deal with the threat of market withdrawal, which I think we'll come to. You know, the kind of changes that Europe would have to make to sort of try and supplant the United States for early entry, I think are not worth the squeeze, are not worth the cost. But you do have leverage, you do have power, and it's a mistake to show up to these negotiations without some leverage and asks of your own. We'll get to that.
Yeah, thank you very much for that answer. Benedetta, from ESIB's perspective, is the US administration's argument a fair characterization of today's pharmaceutical market? Why or why not?
Yes, hello, Sarah, and good afternoon, everyone. So first of all, I can just repeat what Peter said. I think that his arguments are very much resonating with our own line of thinking. What we see here in Europe is indeed an unprecedented increase in pharma prices. We think that we are already paying too much. My members are healthcare payers, public healthcare payers, and pricing and reimbursement authorities. And 2 years ago, we ran a study just to explore how pharma expenditure have increased throughout the years, and we found out quite a disquieting and slowly but surely increasing trend of pharmaceutical expenditure. So we think definitely that we pay too much for medicines. Of course, the job of health insurers is to try to prioritize and rationalize expenditure to the maximum extent possible, while safeguarding value, of course, for patients. In this particular policy context, our fear is that with the shift towards industrial policies, in the end, the already shrinking budgets of healthcare insurers will be redirected to fund industrial policies. This is the overall trend in Europe, whereas, as Peter rightly said in his intervention, we are a solidarity-based system as opposed to the US, which is a free market. So the comparison per se, it's quite a difficult one and does not really stand. To respond to your question precisely, is Europe really the problem? I don't think that the problem is Europe. The problem is how far are we available to go into the negotiations with pharma company? This is something that Europe has been doing forever, and that the US are just now starting to approach as a measure. So the problem for me is the threat tactic from pharmaceutical companies, originator companies, that keep demanding for higher prices, longer monopolies, smaller rebates, no clawbacks, just in order to keep their profits high enough. So there is a fear that this whole MFN and tariffs turmoil may be used to some sort of an advantage by pharma companies, while there is no proof of causality in the end between price increases and investment in Europe. So if the argument is by increasing prices, by extending monopolies, we will be able to bring back research and development and production in Europe, there is no link of causality so far.
Those are some strong fighting words. Thank you very much, Benedetta. If we zoom in a bit more specifically on the most favored nation policy, would it actually lower prices for American patients, Adrian, or would it simply shift the pricing pressure onto other countries like here in Europe? I know Medicines for Europe represents the generics industry, but you have a profound understanding of the pharmaceutical sector. So what's your thought on that?
Well, it's not really clear that it's going to lower the cost of medicines in the United States. First of all, the cost of medicines in the United States is different because it's fragmented according to the type of insurance that you have, whether you have some form of government insurance or you have some form of private insurance, employer, private insurance, etc. So you get different types of insurance, and how much you pay, say co-payment or not, depends on that. There is also a substantial chunk of the American population uninsured, and so who pays 100% privately. We have a substantially smaller percentage of the population that does that in Europe. Very few people pay entirely their drugs in Europe. So it's not clear. I think what is clear, though, is there will be extreme pressure on Western European countries to increase spending on pharmaceuticals. We can see with the Biotech Act, which is somehow related to this, the extension of the SPC, which is the extension of certain aspects of the patent rights and exclusivity and monopoly. This will have a tremendous cost. We're considering it to be around 8 billion euros a year. So, and then if there's pressure on top, not only to extend, let's say, the monopoly period, but also to raise the prices of innovative drugs, which are 70% of the pharmaceutical spending, or actually closer to 80%. Our side of the industry is only 20%. Well, then you're going to have, of course, a huge impact. So I think this is going to be very, very high pressure for Europe. I think there's a different way of looking at it, which is to say, okay, we have a problem with our healthcare system in Europe in the sense that we have a growing demand for health. Mm-hmm. We have a shrinking number of people like you, medical doctors and other healthcare practitioners. So we need to use technologies. Medicines are one, not the only technology that we need to use more of. Not necessarily on-patent drugs. You can also use a lot of off-patent drugs there. But we can optimize this to help treat people better. I think if we would look at it this way, maybe this MFN discussion could be more positive towards public health systems in Europe.
Sarah, if I may for a moment, in terms of
call on you to add.
Oh, great. Well, in terms of the most favored nation effect in the United States, we think it's, as constructed under Trump, it's unlikely to yield many benefits. There's a problem with it being able to evaluate it, which is that the agreements themselves are secret, and the administrative models that the administration has put forward are pilot models in early stage. But there's reason for concern that there are a number of loopholes. If a company signs, and 16 major drug makers have signed confidential agreements with the Trump administration, and those deals aren't accessible to the public. If you sign one of those deals, you're actually exempt from the administrative models for most favored nation, and we don't know what's in the deals. We have filed for access to them under the Freedom of Information Act. We've sued for access to those deals, and we'll see what turns up. One of the sticky issues here is that we do think that reference pricing, as Europe does internally, is a fruitful avenue to explore for future pricing in the United States. That the United States should consider, among many other things, what peer countries are paying when it determines its own sort of stance in price negotiations. And that is the sort of that issue is like rich for discussion with European consumers, because it could come with trade-offs or risks for Europe. How do we safeguard European affordable pricing while pursuing measures like that at home? But that's also kind of a discussion for another day, because that would be through public legislation rather than the kind of deal making that the Trump administration is making. Also, you can have reference pricing or most favored nation without raising prices abroad. What Trump is trying to do is actually counterproductive to most favored nation, because he's trying to raise the prices that would then be used as reference prices for the United States, and use all our trade apparatus to get you to pay higher prices, which we just think is inappropriate bullying that's not going to help consumers here in the US.
So in the end, both ends would end up being more or less losing to a certain extent.
Right, exactly. Like, why are we suddenly in a competition to pay higher prices as though US prices are somehow rational instead of just a product of lobby and monopoly power? Everyone knew 6 months ago that US prices are absolutely ridiculous. So let's not forget that. Let's work on the project of lowering prices together. Let's cooperate in challenging the pharmaceutical industry rather than fighting each other on this.
I was just reading a Reuters report a couple of days ago that said that the U.S. administration, I think, convinced 17 of the largest pharma companies to sign deals for lower prices, but that it was challenging to do that with the mid-sized and smaller pharmaceutical companies. So there are different nuances to the response from the pharmaceutical sector, for sure. Charlotte, I want to turn to you. So if we zoom in on the Section 301 investigation into Germany, when I read about it, for me, it's pretty clear that pharmaceutical pricing is becoming a trade issue rather than a health policy issue, the way we have, I guess, more traditionally discussed pharmaceutical pricing. What does this mean for patients, that we're seeing drug pricing as a trade thing as opposed to a health policy or social security question?
Thank you for that question. I would like first to reconnect to what has just been said by the other panelists, and connected obviously to the Trump administration. I believe that patient interest is the least concern of the Trump administration, and that the real concern is really pharma industry. and how to support pharma industry. And the pharma industry obviously has perfectly understood that, and there is a very strong collaboration between both. And I would like to start saying that as patients, we and patient organization, we do not only feel threatened, we feel blackmailed by industry right now. Because the current discourse now of many companies and also pharma associations is that if you do not agree, if you do not support these higher prices, you will have no more access to drugs. And that's what I call blackmail, actually. As regards Germany, so that's very interesting because actually the Trump administration is going from one country to the other. They started with UK, and we already discussed briefly what they succeeded to get. They are now going to Germany, which is incredible because Germany has always been for the pharma industry, the good guy in Europe, since they're one of the countries where prices were higher. And access also very early because medicines were launched immediately on the market. So, which means that they're trying to divide European countries. In every country is considered as the worst one in Europe, for instance. So I represent France, and in France, we are considered by industry as having the lowest prices. And I really believe we should not give in, and we need to remain united. And there needs to be more collaboration, much more collaboration, not only among member states, but I believe that there needs to be lots of collaboration also between healthcare users organization, citizens organization, patient organization in the US and in Europe, in order to make sure that patient interest remains the key priority. Because right now, what we are seeing in the US, but also in Europe and in the European policymaking, is that there is a huge shift in the health policy and policymaking from public health interest, patients' interest, towards industry interest. And it has been very, very quick, especially in Europe. And I believe that it will have tremendous consequences on patients, because as we said, there is no magic money right now. We know that all healthcare systems are stretched as regard budgets. So we know that what will be given in major prices to industry will be taken out from other healthcare services, so hospitals, GPs, etc. And the study which was mentioned earlier and published this morning in the BMG in UK evaluates the number of additional and death that it could have in UK, avoidable patients' death, over 200,000. So that's huge, and that's a real concern for us.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. I see we have hands and responses from Adrian first, and then Benedetta.
Yeah, maybe one thing to consider for this investigation into Germany. The Trump administration, as was the case with the UK, is using trade policy as its lever for this negotiation. What that implies for the European Union is that Germany, in a strictly legal sense, cannot actually negotiate that with the United States, because trade negotiations are a strict exclusive competence of the European Union, which means that if we believe in following the law, I hope we still do, it's actually the European Union that should be negotiating whatever might or might not be negotiated with Germany or any other European Union member state. Of course, any agreement would require unanimity, because it would be an agreement around pharmaceutical pricing and pharmaceutical policy, which is a national competence. But this is really, from a legal point of view, quite complex. And so I wonder if the European Commission is just going to sit on the sidelines and allow, let's say, Germany or France or other individual countries to negotiate with the US on trade without, basically in violation of the European treaties. I think there's a problem that the European Commission needs to express its position on. And I also think using trade in this context is also incorrect. I think Charlotte is right. This is something that is not the way forward, I think, because basically leveraging the help of the US ambassador and the US administration to try and achieve your pricing negotiations, it's a very short-term strategy. It doesn't make you a partner for public health. And I think pharmaceutical industry, including ours, we need to be a partner. Of course, we need to be paid, but we also need to play our role. And this is not the way to do it.
Thank you very much, Adrian. That segues nicely into the next question I was going to ask, but I want to hear from Benedetta.
Yes, perhaps. Just one word on indeed the trade investigation. The approach seems indeed to be divide and conquer. To the extent to which this is feasible in the EU remains to be defined. Of course, there are concerns that there might be potential bilateral deals, and that, as you said, Sarah, leads us to your next question. But let me just say something that connects to what Charlotte mentioned at the beginning. Health in Europe is not and will never be a commodity. Health in Europe is a social right. This is something that is ruled in the treaties. And let me just mention a recent paper that was published by NCAPRA, which is the group of national competent authorities for pricing and reimbursement and public healthcare payers. And they also explored the consequences of MFN and potential way forward to work, including collaborating. In this sense, while highlighting why Europe is competitive and what is Europe's competitive edge, starting from institutional stability, the fact that we consider indeed health as part of our welfare system, a good infrastructure for basic research, volumes. We have not talked about volume yet, but that is also something that we should consider. And Adrian, I hear your call to pay reasonably well all industries. I think you have a fair point.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you hit the nail on the head there, that there might be a philosophical even difference in how the attitude towards healthcare. Is it a social issue or is it a trade issue? Is it a commercial good, so to speak? And that is something that, people have described as being quite different between the US model of healthcare versus it's not homogenous, but the general Western European approach to healthcare. So I want to move on to part 2 now, which is how Europe should respond, because whether or not we accept the US diagnosis of the situation, Europe does have to face a practical question, which is how to respond to this pressure. So my question is largely related to what you said, Adrian. So the US investigation targets Germany specifically. Can member states or should member states respond individually to this kind of pressure, or is there a case for a more coordinated European response? Can you build on what you just said, Adrian, for us?
So I think there are going to be 2 major impacts of this policy on Europe. First, there's going to be very clear pressure from the US administration to raise innovative drug prices, whether it's in Germany or here in Belgium or in France or in Denmark or wherever. This is going to be clear. Whether the countries concede to that or not is a different question, but there will be pressure for sure. I think if the countries choose to concede, and we've seen in many other areas with the Trump administration that our governments tend to concede, they should try and look at it differently. Maybe if you look at innovative drugs in Europe, maybe wider access to innovative drugs could be given, but without conceding on higher prices. That would lead to more spending and would be a problem for Benedetta's members. I fully acknowledge that. But that could be something of a reasonable compromise. What I mean by that is if you have, let's say, a drug for different types of cancer in Europe, the HTA process will normally not reimburse it for each and every type because of cost effectiveness calculations. Maybe some of that could be looked at again, and you could treat where it makes medical sense in more indications. That would have a higher cost. I'm not denying that, but at least that would be a pro-access spending. The other thing that I think is going to be a big problem is where's the money going to come from? I think Charlotte mentioned it. I estimate with the Biotech Act and the MFN, if it's something similar to the UK agreement, we're looking at least 20 billion euros for Europe per year. The natural increase in spending is another 10 billion. So this is what's projected without those factors. Okay, so you're looking at 30 billion. Where's that money going to come from? I think most countries are facing a tax problem, let's say. So one of the things we're proposing is if we fill in something called the biosimilar void, we have more biosimilar targets to off-patent biologics. We only have 30% today. Maybe we go to 50 or 60%. We could save an additional 10 to 12 billion euros for Benedetta's members. That 10 to 12 billion euros, they can do what they want with it. That's for them to decide. But that could at least give them a little bit of flexibility. The last point I would say is that there's also going to be a problem for Central and Eastern European countries. The pharma legislation was adopted to increase the equity between Eastern Europe, Western Europe, big markets, very, very small markets. That is clearly under threat from this policy. So we also need a solution to not leave, and we have a lot of industry in Central Eastern Europe, to not leave this part of Europe behind. It's 30% of our population. We have a solution, which would be that where the innovator companies do not launch, we launch the generic version or the biosimilar version only in those markets. It's the thesis of the pharmaceutical legislation. Why not? At least we don't leave the patients with nothing. So those are, I think, some ideas that I hope governments could at least consider, or the Commission if it gets involved.
So it sounds like you're very much saying that there is a strong case for a coordinated European response on multiple fronts. Yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah. Charlotte, any thoughts you want to add? You're on mute.
Sorry, I very much agree on the need for coordination and cooperation, but I wanted to come back on innovation. We need to be very careful with the use of the word innovation, because not all new medicines are innovation. And when you see the data published by IQVIA and publicized by industry, so the European countries may have access to less drugs with respect to the US, but do they have really less access to true innovation? That's a different question. And that's the reason why we so much support strong HTA processes, and also the joint evaluation, which is started to be done at EU level, so in the HTA field. Because in France, but I believe that's not very different in other countries. And so the social security system is usually ready to pay high prices for drugs with demonstrated added value. They're not ready to pay for drugs for which this added value is not demonstrated. So that's a point with some complications with clinical trials in some rare diseases, etc. But I believe we need to keep that in mind. It is very important. And the second point I wanted to make is that we will soon have several instruments in order to increase collaboration among European countries. So we already have the HTA regulation. We will soon have the pharmaceutical package, which will allow member states to ask for the launch of the medicine in their country within a fixed time. It will also oblige pharma companies to be transparent about all the public funding they've received for the development of the drugs from the very beginning. So it will also help countries fix fairer prices. And obviously, we will have the CMA, so Critical Medicines Act, which will also help member states do joint procurement and collaborate to buy medicines together, which implies obviously transparency, but which implies that a stronger capacity of negotiation with respect to the pharma industry, because we see that divided, we're weak.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. So that sounds like another thumbs up for a more coordinated European approach and response. Benedetta?
Yes, thank you, Sarah. Perhaps going back to what Adrian proposed as a solution, meaning expanding access to medicines and potentially with the objective to lower prices. Just one remark. It is in the end a commercial strategy of originator companies to launch or not to launch in all members. So there is, let's say, a limited margin on what our members, both payers, HTA, and regulators can do in trying to steer this process. So let's make sure to underline that this is, first of all, a commercial strategy from pharmaceutical companies. On the other hand, and also to reconnect with what Charlotte said, I think that the European HTA process is just unfolding now. And I hope that we will give it the chance to unfold properly, because it can indeed bring significant successes. And it has shown it already to a certain extent. And this is actually very important, because HTA defines in a way willingness to pay for quality of medicines. So in my members' perspective, having a strong HTA system is fundamental. And it's it's instrumental also for informed pricing decisions back down the line. So, and this is also something that I believe the US is looking at, because we are not the only continent having to think about cost of containment. This is one. Budgets are shrinking everywhere. And with the new trend, with the IRA precedent and the trend in pricing negotiations, we should consider that the HTA has a significant role. So if I have to respond, what should the EU do to, let's say, kind of be resilient in light of this evolving geopolitical context? I believe that trying to implement what we have already in place and what can bring success is for sure one way forward.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I want to build on this. So in the scenario where the EU has to respond, so at the EU level, to US threats of trade measures, where should they draw red lines? Like, what are the lines that we cannot cross as an EU, as the EU? So perhaps, Peter, I know you're from the US, but if you were here, where would you draw those red lines? Where would you suggest we draw those red lines?
I think you have to start by saying no, absolutely not. Our medicines pricing, our health is off limits, but we can have a constructive dialogue about other things. And by the way, here are the things we want from you in the areas that we don't think the United States has been fair to Europe. You have to come, you got to remember, right? Trump is a bully. So is the pharmaceutical industry. So you have to come in with leverage. If you are seeking to accommodate, they will keep coming back and taking your lunch money, right? You have to sort of hit back and have leverage to start with. We were talking a little bit about the problem of early market access. One thing that you can do there that is leverage. You got to remember how serious this is, right? Like they're threatening patient access. At least the pharmaceutical companies are. They're saying we just won't sell a drug in your country, or we'll hold on to it for a long time. That's outrageous. I mean, the public contract of these companies is to provide to the public the medicines that they make. If they are not offering those medicines for sale, I don't know why they should continue to benefit from the various tax credits and government granted monopoly protections that they do. One thing that you can do about that particular problem is if a company is sort of exercising their nuclear option and saying we're just not going to sell, or they're delaying to sell, you can actually issue a compulsory license on that drug and authorize generic competition. It is the most basic reason that compulsory licensing exists in rules. It just means that if the patented drug is not for sale and they're blocking the ability of other companies to sell it, then let the generics come in instead. And I think that's one example of the kind of leverage that you've got to come to the table with. But and Medicines for Europe, I think, talks about a similar idea in their policy proposal, which I thought was interesting, and some other constructive ideas. I mean, there are areas for cooperation in the United States. There are other things that the United States wants, including in pharmaceuticals. Working toward a secure supply chain, active ingredients that are available for all, increasing manufacturing generally. Can be useful so long as you're not prejudicing the access of other countries, right? So there are other things that we can do together. I think the other thing to remember is, are you guys familiar with taco? You heard about taco? So this is what the Wall Street bros say about Trump. Trump always chickens out. And it is possible, if you show up to negotiation with a very strong position and leverage and just concerted collective resolve, that's not an area we intend to negotiate on at all. You can prevail.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go, this is going to be a tour de table question. So each of you give me your short answer, and then, because we already have lots of questions in the Q&A, which is fantastic. So keep sending those along. Adrian, I saw you nodding. So from a manufacturing supply security angle, where are the red lines that you would draw?
Yeah, so I think Peter's absolutely right. I also think that, every US administration has a political problem with drug prices, because I think American voters have expressed time and time again a concern over drug prices. And the Trump administration, as the Biden administration before him, has tried and not really succeeded in lowering these prices. I mean, where we could help the US is, we are the biggest market and the biggest industry for biosimilar medicines, okay? The US market is still, frustratingly closed due to what we would consider in Europe oftentimes anti-competitive behavior. It's different in the US. They have different definitions of that. But we would be happy to work with any US administration to help them to open up the biosimilar market to competition. These are products that have lost their patents sometimes 10 years ago, and they have no competition in the US. So, this would help the government to lower the prices of drugs in the United States. As was mentioned as well, we still produce critical antibiotics. We still produce critical hospital medicines. We still produce critical API in Europe. The only other producers are India and China. The US can work with whichever country it wants to be a partner, but maybe Europe could, since we are kind of military allies, maybe we could be a good partner. That's something the EU can offer to partner around. So I think, and the last point, as Peter mentioned, we're proposing this licensing concept, a kind of voluntary approach. But as he said, if that doesn't work, if we're left with no medicines, and still offering incentives and long protection periods and things like this, the TRIPS agreement provides solutions. But also in Europe, if you have a patent, let's say in a country, and there's no product sold there, you have no damages. So you can have a patent, but you can't get an infringement suit in that country. So, our industry's hands are not that as tied as they think they are.
Okay. Thank you very much for that answer. Benedetta, very quickly, where are your red lines?
Yes, just one. No blind checks. We are not ready to pay more for medicines without a guarantee of quality and supply security in Europe.
That's a very clear one, yeah. And Charlotte, from the patient's perspective, what's the red line?
I think red lines have been crossed already. So blackmailing patients is crossing red lines. And so that's the reason why I believe that the only solution really is for member states to speak with one voice. And I would suggest, so I'm not speaking in the name of my organization because that's something we did not discuss, but something, an alliance which would be similar to what does exist or what used to exist with the NATO in terms of military should be the answer. So if you do not provide your medicine in one country, you will not provide the medicines in any of the European countries. We need to stick together and to protect each other, because patients are, there's no French patients, Polak patients, etc. Patients are patients, and they all need to have access to the treatments and not only the medicines they need. Let's keep in mind that medicines is not everything.
Absolutely. Now I want to move on to the last part of our panel, which is sort of the vision and the strategy for the future before we go to audience Q&A. So basically, we want to answer what kind of medicines market Europe ultimately wants to build. There was an IQVIA report that highlighted the variation in delays from marketing authorization to reimbursement time. You've alluded to this earlier. And that time ranges from 4 months to 28 months, depending on where we are and what country you look at. So I'm just wondering, are there any best practices or examples from member states or even other regions when it comes to pricing and reimbursement that we should take note of and consider scaling up? Perhaps, Benedetta, you have some insights on this.
Yes, thank you. So first of all, and this has been said already in this conversation, I think that there is a shift now towards a collaborative approach to what is considered as a common threat. So already this more collaborative, cooperative mindset is something that I would highlight as a good practice. We have seen discussions in EBSCO last month and a statement presented by Beneluxa, which is an association of Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Austria, Ireland, among the member states, supporting a more collaborative approach. And going back to what we have discussed earlier, trying to to avoid the divide and conquer kind of approach. So I think that if one wants to see the positive, kind of the silver lining in this discussion, this move towards a more collaborative mindset, working as an ecosystem together with patients, is something that should be highlighted as a general and common best practice, I would say, at this stage, yes.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on that from anyone? Yeah, Charlotte?
Yeah, so that's more this time about a French best practice. Just wanted to highlight that the numbers given by industry in terms of access to treatments are misleading. We know that, and there has been other data published by some of Benedetta's members, like including like CNAM in France, because, for instance, it does not take into account the early access programs, which in some countries are extremely important and cover a huge number of patients. That's the case of France. And when you include them, so the reduction in terms of access to treatments is huge. So these early access programs, which allow to have access to drugs sometimes even before they get their market authorization under strict conditions, obviously, that I will not get into, can be also an answer.
That's a great point. Yeah, thank you very much.
Sorry to cut you. May I just add something? Because sorry, also to Adrian, I saw his hand raised. Just to say that it is true that many of our members respond to the weight report. We see it in France, we see it in Belgium, we see it in Spain. So there are reports that try to propose counter arguments to what FPA is saying through the weight report, which again sometimes includes medicine that have not been purposefully launched in many member states.
Yeah, noted. Adrian?
Yeah, so I think, sometimes because healthcare is a national competence, we say, well, it would be too difficult for us to ever coordinate and ever do anything on a kind of European scale, which doesn't mean transferring the competence for health from the EU. But you can see in this case where we likely have to do that. And it's actually not that hard, because most of the key players that you would need to have around the table, whether it's consumers, healthcare insurers and mutuals, different sides of the pharmaceutical industry, ministers of health, etc., you can bring them around the table, and some of the solutions are quite straightforward. Benedetta mentioned the EU HDA. If part of this issue is acclaimed, needs to be demonstrated, unfair lack of access to expensive innovative drugs, that can be looked at and that can be adjusted. Which way? That's not for me to decide. I'm not the HDA expert, but those kind of things can easily be adjusted, actually. Also, what Charlotte is saying, we don't just need medicines, but we do need medicines, and we're going to need more of it because of the demographics of Europe. But that doesn't necessarily mean we need only innovative on patent drugs. We're looking at cardiovascular right now, and in many of these indications, we only need to use generic medicines differently, sometimes more, sometimes less, to deal with many of the issues. And that will not be expensive. It's just a question of coordination between us. That will free up resources that could be spent elsewhere on some kind of adjusted HTA. So there's so much we can do together. I would wish that we would have a cooperative approach and we could bring these groups together and try and solve some of these things rather than using threats, President Trump and other people like that who maybe are not technically the best masters at this kind of discussion.
Thank you very much.
If I might, I'd like to briefly address this issue of the perceived or the delays to medicine marketing in Europe, because I think it is the primary counter argument to what we're talking about. I think it's serious, right? And I think patients' health and lives are at stake in a way that we have to think seriously about. And I don't have all the answers to it, but it is something we can collectively grapple with, and Europe can work to accelerate. I also think you have to weigh that period against price-based rationing and lives lost. The amount to which Europe would have to raise prices in order to move in line ahead of the United States or together with the United States, you're going to have a lot of other health costs, and you're going to have less health budget to spend on protecting people. And in the United States, 1 in 3, 1 in 4 patients experiences cost-based rationing, like self-rations access to treatment because it's just too expensive. I had a moment recently where I had sort of a tough question on this myself. I'm still trying to figure out whether I'm going to take a medicine that is indicated for me because of its cost. And again, you have leverage here, right? Because they've threatened patients. It would be a proportionate but far less evil response to threaten or take away the monopoly, right? We have to come to these things with strength. And by the way, another way, perhaps the most effective thing we could do to support shorter delays to marketing in the EU would actually be to lower US prices, right? Which is not your fault, not your fight, that's our fight. But in the United States, if we're successful in really challenging pharma and bringing down prices, then the difference in the market's lucrative aspect for pharma is going to be less. So like, again, the answer is fight pharma.
Okay. I want to stick to that theme of cooperation. And before I get to my next question, I just want to let our audience and our panelists know that we are going to go 5 minutes over just because we have so many great questions in the chat box. It would be a bit of a pity not to get to a few of them. But my last question before we move on to that is for you, Peter, actually. Beyond today's tensions, are there areas where Europe and the US could work together on pharma innovation, access financing, rather than treating this like as a zero-sum game? Like, where can we cooperate across the Atlantic?
We've had in the past, and I think it's probably still active on some level, a sort of interagency, intergovernmental, a transatlantic dialogue on cost containment, on pharmaceutical pricing measures. And I think like that's something that we can take very seriously, looking at best practices. For what it's worth, Germany's sort of practice of price negotiation was actually something that figured quite prominently in the US's own consideration of price negotiation when we passed legislation a few years ago, which, by the way, Adrian, I'd quibble a bit. I do think our Medicare price negotiation has reduced prices in important ways in the United States. And the path toward increased access in the United States is to continue to expand that negotiation power. But so we can cooperate on best price practices for containment. We can cooperate on critical materials and health security, some of the issues that Adrian was talking about in terms of there are medicine shortages, right, in the United States that are quite serious. So where can we cooperate to mitigate shortages? That's something that would be of mutual interest, that would have less costs. And then I think finally, we're all a bit traumatized in the U.S. at this moment because there was incredible cuts to our health research programs, and looking at ways going forward to reinvest and to sustain meaningful R&D. The best way to support R&D isn't to have this sort of like price fight or to treat it as some kind of proxy for the attractiveness of the market by sales, but it's to It's to work on financing R&D and our education systems and to attract the best labor forces in the world, right, that have the capacity to work with these issues. So we should look at health financing and financing the scientific community, which has been decimated here in the United States, unfortunately, over the past year.
Thank you very much, Peter. And I hope that you feel better and that you are able to access the treatment that you need. I'd like to move on now to the audience Q&A for a few minutes. So we have a question from Solène Jouan, who is from the European Patients Forum. So I'll just read it out. When we discussed this with the pharmaceutical companies, they told us quite frankly that they would postpone the launch of their products in Europe. What leverage do we have in negotiations when they tell us they do not intend to lose the US market? Shouldn't we be rewarding pharmaceutical companies that decide to stay in Europe and not give in to Donald Trump's blackmail? Thank you for your feedback. I feel like this is a question that maybe Charlotte can take because of the themes of blackmailing and how should patients respond.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to be very transparent, I wanted to say that Française Santé is a member of the European Patients Forum, so for conflicts of interest. So yeah, we are completely being blackmailed, and I'm really wondering if we should reward a company for pursuing its purpose, which is selling medicines in Europe and remaining in Europe. I believe that's potentially a vicious cycle. Because in the end, we are already in a vicious cycle of prices. We know that every medicine comes with a price which is higher to the previous medicines in the same indication. So I'm afraid that it will not help much. And especially because that's something I wanted to say from the beginning. We are working in something which is completely virtual. So for the moment, it's just speculation, blackmail. There has been that the director for research and R&D of IQVIA in France recently said that for the moment there is no demonstrated impact of the MFN in France. So for the moment there is nothing. We are just speculating. So I believe it is dangerous to go forward. I would rather push back, stick together, and create unity among member states.
Thank you very much, Charlotte.
Sarah, I'm really sorry. I'm just going to have to say goodbye to everybody, and thank you very much for the invitation because I'm late for another call. But thanks a lot for including me in this.
Thank you so much for your contributions. We really appreciate it. The next question is from Zoe Dingwall, who is from the European Healthcare Distribution Association. And Zoe writes, it was reported that U.S. drug makers are planning to raise the prices of 350 branded medicines. I'd have to fact check that number. I'm not sure how much that has evolved.
Yeah, that's right. That's happening.
Great. Oh, wow. That's a lot of medicines. U.S. pharmaceutical companies are protected monopolies and are able to set excessive prices in the U.S. because the government leaves drug prices largely unrelated. Can EU competition law or the TRIPS agreement help Europe to better protect the rights of European patients? I don't know if there's any takers for that. Maybe Peter, if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I can say on the first point, so the standard practice of the industry in the United States is actually to raise prices twice a year on existing.
I'm shocked at how high that number is.
Oh, yeah, on existing drugs. Can you hear me? We're good?
Yeah.
And above the rate of inflation, right? So it's actually one of the ways that pharmaceutical industry is creating value for shareholders in the US is it's just expected. They just call it taking a price increase, and they raise the price of old drugs. So this is this strange sector where prices of old products just keep getting higher and higher faster than inflation. That's actually not an intellectual property issue, and I believe it's an issue we face with the generics as well. So it might be an area where Arjane and I are sort of different views. But there are things that can be done on that. There's legislation proposed in the United States to help curb it, and it's also there in the Inflation Reduction Act. So we're taking measures. The TRIPS agreement would mostly speak to the newer medicines, the patent-based medicines, and yeah, I mean, again, they're right now both Europe and the United States are providing government protected monopolies to pharmaceutical companies for a very long period of time. And they can renew those monopolies if they switch one formulation of a medicine for another. Both our blocs could get much more serious about curbing those excesses, and the compulsory licensing that I mentioned is sort of a key way to do that. Even, I mean, I guess just to say, even talking about, like, you threaten our patients, we can take away your monopoly. Even just talking about that more seriously, that has been seen historically as like by some as like, oh, isn't that like a little extreme or something? Well, I think we have to be cognizant of the moment that we're in. It is not extreme to not always grant monopoly protections. And, it's something if we're serious about it in the discussion, it'll give us some power in negotiations. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And thank you to Zoe for the excellent question. Charlotte, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something. So I just wanted to say, on the compulsory licensing and TRIPS agreements, there is really no appetite in Europe from governments to use this possibility. And we've seen that with governments from left, right, whatever. So I believe, just wanted to come back to the fact, which was briefly mentioned by Adrian, on the best way to limit monopolies, to limit it from the beginning. And with the biotech legislation, we have a huge risk in Europe of extending these monopolies of the most expensive drugs by 12 or even 24 months, which is what industry is asking. 24 months, that's huge. And it will have a huge impact on drugs, so that's on prices. That's the reason why we need to stick together on the legislation which are currently being discussed, so that there is no extension whatever of intellectual property rights.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. I'm going to take one last question, and it's for you, Peter, and then we're going to have to call it. So Els Torelli, apologies if I'm mispronouncing, is asking, do we have a list of medicines that are getting on the market significantly earlier in the US and that are really important from a medical point of view? Has anyone estimated the gained health impact and price of that?
Not that I'm aware. It's actually a piece of research, I guess, that we may look into as well. I think something that's important here is, right, we need to separate the actual problems from the PR campaigns. And, when they talk about like an R&D exodus, which shouldn't be linked to price or sales at all, they're different things. Or when they talk about the medicine delays. I mean, I think the latter point actually is serious and is getting more serious, at least potentially. Even though we think that Trump is ultimately giving pharma a pass, it's clear that the drug makers are concerned about most favored nation. Both things can be true at the same time. And in some cases, maybe modeling out, well, what would happen if we pulled X drug from Y market? So I think we have to take it seriously with all the measures that we've talked about here today. And at the same time, I agree that it would be good to have a more empirical, data-informed approach, because just because the industry threatens something, doesn't make it so, and it's very much in their interest to scare us right now. So,
thank you very much, Peter, for that answer. Unfortunately, that is all the time that we have. I'd like to extend my sincere thanks to our panelists for such a thoughtful and engaging discussion, and to each of you online for your great questions and your engagement. We really, really appreciate it. For me, today's conversation highlighted just how complex the issue is, and we've seen that medicine pricing is no longer solely a question of healthcare economics. It increasingly sits at the intersection of health policy, innovation, trade, and geopolitics as well. So it's really an increasingly complex issue. And we've heard different perspectives on the pressures facing Europe, the implications of the US MFN approach and recent trade developments, and the balancing act that must be found between ensuring affordable access to patients, and maintaining sustainable healthcare systems, and having access to new medications. Now, if today's discussion has shown us anything, it's that patients must remain at the center of these discussions, even where views differ on how best to achieve that. From my end, I hope that today's discussion provided some valuable insights, and perhaps just as importantly, that it highlighted the questions that policymakers, industry leaders, patient groups, and healthcare systems we'll continue to grapple with in the months and perhaps even in the years ahead. So thank you all very much for the privilege of moderating this panel. I wish you all a great rest of your day, and I thank you for staying a little bit longer with us. And I look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you all so much.
Thanks all.